I realize that it's been a while since I've posted a YouTube video, and I felt that now is probably an interesting time to do that. I was reviewing some thoughts this morning as I was working, and this just thought came to my mind of what if I just looked up the history of some of the terms that we use for describing individuals, sex, gender, male, female, and look at the history of the English words for that. And kind of got into this rabbit hole of just looking up definitions and trying to find dictionaries online and various other sources. I actually ended up buying a couple of dictionaries on Amazon, just the ones in the 1960s and 70s, just to kind of round out the whole collection. And what was interesting with looking at these definitions is kind of this cool evolution of our understanding. You can almost see the scientific progression going through this process, and I think that's what really was really fascinating with this is just kind of just capturing these moments of scientific understanding, just expanding our knowledge and just going, aha, this is really cool. So I thought I would share these definitions and just show you the resources that I pulled them from. They're available online. They're free to use. I did end up getting a Oxford subscription, which is the England English dictionary over across the pond. So, without too much further ado, I want to start out with just looking at definitions and share my screen and go, here, let's take a look at this. And let's look at it together. So, what you're seeing here is just basically Word. I just formatted it the way I did and just looked at the history of biologic sex definitions. And I was able to find four different dictionaries. There's the modern dictionary, which of course, I've talked about it in the past. It's the characteristics that lead to the development of the sperm or the ova. That's the current understanding of biologic sex. So going back in time, our understanding is not what it is now. It has evolved and it has advanced dramatically since the even the 1100s. So first thing I did was just look up male and female. And interestingly enough, take a look at the 1100s to 1500s. This is a online dictionary of Middle English provided by the University of Michigan. And the reason why this dictionary exists is to actually help us with understanding context and language during that era. So if there is a biblical text or an Old English text or some book that they're looking up, they would go to this dictionary just to compare definitions and understanding of how they would phrase things, what words they would use at that time. One of the things that I was really fascinated with was the concept from Oxford that said this is a living language. Language evolves, it adapts, it becomes, it moves and ebbs and flows with culture changes, political events. Those who have seen the movie, the numbers, the one where NASA going up into space, they were computers. These colored black women were called computers, and we don't use that term to describe somebody who literally computes. We use those for the devices that we actually use nowadays as a computer. So our language does evolve over time. It's the same thing with all of this stuff. So back in the 1100s, female was of man and animals, female, a female, female complexion, the physiological constitution of a female. So even back then, this concept of overall, we were looking at somebody and saying this is a female, and this is not a definition. They're using the term female right in that definition that they're using, and as a concept, this doesn't work. How do you describe female in a dictionary? Well, you don't use the word female, it doesn't work. But you can see the sense that I'm trying to get across with this physiologic constitution, this overall arching picture, looking at the whole person. In the 1755 Samuel Johnson's dictionary, I really honestly had to laugh at this one. Not male. That is so insightful. Really, really actually did not help at all with that one. It's not until the 1800s that we actually start seeing this evolution and draw in of these concepts of really actually what defines male and female. And that's actually kind of filled in through a lot of the development of medicine, actually, which is really fascinating to kind of see this process of thinking and scientific approach of how would you describe somebody who is male or female? And in their context, they said among animals, one of that sex which conceives and brings forth young. Okay, so it's a process. We're having a child, bearing children. Now, the challenge with that is how does that work? What is the process internally with that? And during this time, this is something that they're discovering as they go. Anatomy is becoming more formalized and understood. We start to get into hormones and physiologic differences and looking at testosterone versus estrogen. And so you can see in the 1913 dictionary, the Webster Dictionary, an individual of the sex which conceives and brings forth young, but they also include this wider sense. It's not just a simple definition. We're actually expanding and expounding on it, that which has an ovary and produces ova. So it's one of those where they're trying to capture this idea of what female sex is all about, but they're failing in the sense that what is that one thing that defines a female versus a male? Keep in mind that during this time, during the 1800s and 1900s, they're also encountering people who do not fit the standard quote unquote profile or the constitution or the not male. There's variations of anything in between. So they're trying to capture the idea of how do we be inclusive of everybody, keeping in mind all this variation that we're seeing in between. Let's take a look at male. Um, During the 1100s and 1500s, obviously with the culture during that time, males tended to be more dominant in the culture. The focus was centered around the male. The female was kind of the second thought, which is why we have that definition from the 1755 of not male. Um, Still, we're running into the same problems. So 1100s to 1500s, a male human being, a boy, also a male fetus, a male animal, bird, fish, or snake, which again doesn't help us hugely because male is in the definition. It doesn't work that way. Even the 1755 really doesn't help us with the definition overall. Male in composition signifies. It's almost like that you have to have this inherent understanding that this is part of our culture, this is part of human beings and society. And when we run into these variations in between, it's difficult for us to wrap our brains around. As we moved forward into the 1820s and the 1913s, pertaining to the sex that procreates young and applied to animals of all kinds as a male child, a male beast, fish, or fowl. So this is the difference is, procreates young versus conceives and brings forth young. Obviously, we needed to work on the definitions of either one of those. But in 1913, of or pertaining to the sex that begets or procreates young, in a wider sense, the sex that produces spermatozoa. So now we're actually pulling in ova and sperm into the midst of all this, by which the ova are fertilized. So now the scientific medical understanding has completed. We made that discovery, we made that connection by this time. So you can see just this evolutionary process of how this has come to be. Now, in terms of the current definition, where the definition falls under the gametes that are produced, the sperm and the egg, this is definitely a process that happens, and I'll get to that in a second here. Now, the biologic sex definition. Now, I added biologic sex because I didn't want to actually try to describe the act of sex, but to actually talk about anatomy. And biologic sex basically just talks about the distinction between male and female, the property by which an animal is male or female. There's this distinction that happens between the two of them. I thought this 1828 definition was interesting. And again, this is one of those where we have this conceived idea that there is these notions that have to be in play for both males and females. So the distinction between male and female, or the property of character by which an animal is male or female. And they added this caveat into there. They added this extra clarifying action. The male sex is usually characterized by muscular strength, boldness, and firmness, and the female sex is characterized by softness, sensibility, and modesty. And in the same similar idea that we ran into with 1913, the distinguishing peculiarity. Apparently, we're peculiar. Peculiarity. Just try saying that 10 times fast. Of male or female in both animals and plants. So they're basically is trying to distinguish between the two of them, but they don't clarify. They don't distinguish a lot more beyond that. They just say that there's this peculiar difference that exists, but we don't define it. So in both animals and plants, the physical difference between male and female, the assemblage of properties or qualities by which male is distinguished from female. So this certainly sounds like a very cultural aspect of this. These definitions in of themselves are not scientific based. Go back to the 1828. Male sex is defined by muscular strength, boldness, and firmness. We can all think of people who stretch well beyond this definition that they're using. It's the same thing with the female sex or a female individual. We already know lots of people that stretch beyond this definition in its entirety. So we have to be careful with how we approach this definition because in the past, there has been this social context that has been added into it. And that's more just the society of the time that there was a history that we're working with. There was a suffrage movement. Women didn't have rights. There's a lot more to this than just meets the eye. Now, I did take a look at gender, and gender in of itself is mostly a distinguishing characteristic. A class or a kind of individual. We're grouping people. So gender actually had multiple different meanings and really didn't actually have a specific reference to sex only. There was a few additional insights into there. And you can go back and look at how they approach certain things. There was even some reference to a structure of the arm. And I think maybe I put that in there. But 1828 is really where we start to see the word coming into light. And properly kind sort. That's what I was talking about. We're sorting a group of people. We're chaining them. We can say a gender of geese. That's a group. There's a sort. We sorted them from a different set of individuals. And in the context of sex, male and female, we sorted, we grouped them. And that's actually how the definition was used. It wasn't necessarily synonymous with sex, it was a concept. And then they clarify that in the next point on bullet point number 3. In grammar, a difference in words to express distinction of sex, usually a difference of termination in nouns. So we're gendering creatures, we're gendering animals, we're using different terminations. So that's how we're using it grammatically. We're using it different in the sense that we're compared to biologic sex. In 1913, sex, male or female, a classification of nouns primarily according to sex. Again, it's kind of just carrying that concept forward of we're just grouping, we're classifying. So taking a look back at this, looking at the history, again, you can see this evolution of time, this evolution of understanding, and a lot of the scientific principles that we understand now have certainly exploded way more rapidly than we ever thought. So a lot of the things that we're actually trying to incorporate with this is things like the variations of sexual development. So when we scientists in society chose gametes as the distinction between male and female, the reason why we have to look at reason why that happened. Why did we choose these final structures to make that determination of sex? Well, because there's two. There's the sperm, there's the ova. Now, the caveat with that is it's not just two. We have to make accounts for the fact that you can produce none or you can produce both. So there are individuals out there that have ovotestes, both a ovum or ovary and a testes in the same structure. Or you can have an individual with a testes on one side and an ovary on the other side. Those individuals do exist. So it's not just saying sperm, egg, it's nothing, sperm, egg, both. So in that context, in that highlight, there's actually four. So then the next question comes into timing. Well, if we're producing or were you saying the gametes are something that is produced, that's how we're going to distinguish sex? Well, then you need to be able to produce those structures or those cells. You have to have the structures to be able to support that. So when we say assigned sex at birth, we don't produce those structures. Males, XY males at birth do not produce sperm. Sperm is produced at puberty. It's the same thing with the eggs and the ovaries. The eggs are there at present at birth with females. They're not in use or in production until, again, puberty. So when we actually look back and say, hey, this child is just born, how do we define sex? Well, we actually look at external anatomy. That's all we've ever really done. And the only reason why we would actually vary from that or actually go into anything different or look at genetic tests or studies is if there was a physical characteristic that made us think, oh, we need to take a look at different, ambiguous genitalia. But not everybody who is born has clear ambiguous genitalia and can still be intersex. This includes people with complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, or Swyer syndrome, or De la Chapelle syndrome, where it's an XX individual who masculinizes and develops as a male. So it's one of those things where we have to be careful and mindful of how we group and categorize individuals and define them in a set category. So right now in our country, there is a lot of laws being established that try to define sex assigned at birth. And they try to define it based off of gamete production, which is the current consensus of our time. Now, going back through history, we've seen that this definition has certainly evolved. But right now, this is what we're basing it off of. So we could, if we really wanted to, say, well, sex is based off of the presence of an ovary or a testes. Well, you also have to account for the fact that there's none present. You also have to say that there's potential for both of them to be present or any variation in between. So again, being mindful and careful of how we approach this. So when we define these laws in the sex, we also see that they try to include exceptions to the rules. The caveat with that is already exclusionary. We have already excluded intersex individuals. And consequently, we also we can exclude transgender individuals as well, or anybody with gender dysphoria. So, for example, people who are born with ambiguous genitalia, we look for a genetic cause for why that is. But in fact, only 50% of them get to be able to have that genetic cause identified. There are other things that can lead to ambiguous genitalia. There are a lot of different things that lead to differences of sexual development or variations of sexual development. And there is indeed overlap between somebody who has gender dysphoria, who can be intersex, who can have a difference of sexual development. All of these things can be included in the midst of all this. So there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of interplay between all of these different concepts. So keeping our mind open to this idea really is going to be helpful with us seeing people for who they really are and helping them along their way and helping them understand themselves better is to see beyond the scientific definition of just gametes, seeing the whole person, every part of it. And when we see every part of the whole person, we get to see all the variations in between as well, including things that we don't necessarily see externally. So thank you for your time.